Tonight, we're going to talk about an issue that comes up a lot in ethics of reproduction, and namely, it's a lot of issues that surround in vitro fertilization. So, in vitro fertilization is roughly a process that you use to conceive a child with help of a lab. Usually, what this involves in a straight couple is that a woman will go into a lab and she'll get blood work and stuff like that done. She'll decide that she wants the procedure. Then physicians or counselors will give her drugs that will basically stimulate her egg production. Then eventually the eggs will be extracted from her via another procedure. And then in a lab, they will use semen from a partner or from a donor for whatever the couple's preferences are. And then the lab will fertilize the embryos in a lab setting. And then the doctor will decide how many of the fertilized embryos to implant back into the woman or into a surrogate mother in the case that the woman cannot birth the child herself. Okay. This was a really troublesome technology whenever it came out. People who were conceived and born by this were called test tube babies. There was a lot of weird stuff that went around. This gave rise, though, to a lot of really important bioethical issues, because not only did in vitro fertilization allow couples with fertility issues to begin to have children, with the advent of genetic screening, where we could extract some genetic information from the fertilized embryos and see whether they have certain traits or not, that led to the question about what we should be selecting for or what we should be selecting against with these types of things. Okay. And so the articles that I'm going to talk about today are by ethicist Laura Purdy and Deena Davis, and they're both going to have arguments roughly for the same conclusion, which is that we should start to select against certain illnesses or traits or diseases. All right, so this is Laura Purdy, and we're taking information from her genetics and reproductive risk. Can having children be immoral? And one of the central problems of this paper, and I think she really tries to bring this up, is that procreation is a very, very serious thing. It's not just something that all people should be entitled to do, at least morally speaking. If you're doing your moral due diligence and you're trying to figure out what you should do in life, something like bringing a new life into this world is something that you should carefully consider. And this doesn't matter whether you're using IVF, whether you're using genetic screening, whatever else it is, you should really take seriously the issue of procreation. And this is partially because there are a lot of issues, especially genetic diseases, Tay-Sachs, Huntington's, many others that can lead to very, very serious suffering and harm in the child who is born with those. So her thesis in this article is roughly that we should prevent harm whenever possible by preventing the birth of children with serious illnesses. And she takes this to apply not only to cases of in vitro fertilization where you're doing genetic screening, but an important point as well is that she takes this for just natural conception as well. If you and your partner know that you have some sort of genetic risk for a disease like Huntington's, you should really hesitate and really take the time to think about whether or not you should be having a child in the first place. So she's not advocating abortion. She's not necessarily advocating genetic screening. She's saying this applies also to natural births as well, because procreation is very, very serious. And so I like this quote here because it gets basically the crux of her article. And she says, in the general scheme of things, human misery is most efficiently reduced by concentrating on noxious social and political arrangements. Nonetheless, we shouldn't ignore the preventable harm just because it is confined to a relatively small corner of life. All right? So what she's kind of saying here is that people don't have the moral freedom to reproduce however they like. unconcerned completely with the consequences. They need to figure this sort of stuff out. And while it might be the case that a lot of the issues that someone with an illness or a disability might face in life are purely social, in the sense that society could do a much better job of accommodating them and making sure that organizations and buildings and all sorts of things accommodate people who aren't just average people. Despite that fact, by using certain technologies, we can in fact prevent the harms of really serious illness, and we should do that. In fact, it's much stronger than that. We are doing something wrong if we are not using technology, or if we are not just using precaution in preventing new life to come into this world that will suffer from debilitating and serious illness. Okay, so let's kind of look at her argument. The first thing is that she's going to talk about people with certain diseases as suffering immensely. Okay, and this isn't a suffering that's constrained just to the person. This is suffering that loved ones feel whenever they see their loved ones suffering as well. Okay, so it's not even something that's constrained to an individual person. It's also something that affects anyone who loves that person. And so there's just widespread suffering that can happen if someone, for example, is born with something like Huntington's disease. And so I just want to read this excerpt. This isn't her words. This is a research study that she's talking about that talks about Huntington's disease. And so here's a little blurb about that. Onset is insidious. Personality changes, obstinacy, moodiness, lack of initiative, frequent antedate or accompany the involuntary choretic movements. These usually appear first in the face, neck, and arms and are jerky, irregular, and stretching in character. Contractions of the facial muscles result in grimaces. Those of the respiratory muscles, lips, and tongue lead to hesitating, explosive speech. Irregular movements of the trunk are present, and the gait is shuffling and dancing. Tendon reflexes are increased. Some patients display fascious euphoria. Others are spiteful, irascible, destructive, and violent. Paranoid reactions are common. Poverty of thought and impairment of attention, memory, and judgment occur. As the disease progresses, walking becomes impossible, swallowing difficult, and dementia profound. Suicide is not uncommon. So given the reality that diseases like Huntington's disease change every single facet of life, and not just a little bit, right? To a large extent, even to the extent to where people with Huntington's often enough commit suicide. She's saying, if we can prevent that from happening by not letting children with Huntington's be born, we should take that prospect very seriously. And in fact, we should consider ourselves doing a bad thing if we are not preventing those harms from happening. Okay. The core of a lot of the reason that she's saying this is that children, in her mind, should lead what she calls a minimally satisfying life. Right? It's not good enough that children just survive as some sort of animal, right? There's something more to life. And she says, look, minimally decent or minimally satisfying, that's going to be really, really difficult to define. But I can tell you that it's not good enough to just say that it is minimally satisfying insofar as the person just doesn't want to die every single moment of their lives, right? That's way too minimal of a standard. Rather, there are a lot of different ways that we can define this. So she gives 3 different ways. The first is just to consider what would it be like to have a minimal standard of well-being. She doesn't bring Aristotle into it, but we could easily think of Aristotle and his conception of the good life or eudaimonia or flourishing. What do we need in order to live that kind of life? Can that child, do they stand a fighting chance at achieving eudaimonia? Right? If not, that is not minimally satisfying. But she also talks about utilitarian and contractarian varieties. So on the utilitarian standard, maybe we would say just preventing unnecessary unhappiness or harm. Maybe there's a threshold of harm or unhappiness that we're not willing to tolerate. Or on the contractarian, so she's thinking, I'm imagining of someone like John Rawls, which is we just want to make sure that there isn't unfair disadvantage of certain types of people. So again, this goes back to the quote that I shared at the beginning, which is, it might be the case that we can look at society and we can just see that a lot of social arrangements, quite plainly, are bullshit. They're stacked against people. We're not doing enough to give resources to help people who are differently abled. She can completely affirm that. But then she can say, nonetheless, if this child were born right here, right now in my community, would they stand a chance at being disadvantaged? And if they're severely disadvantaged by the illness that you could have prevented, that's not a good thing if you don't prevent that. Okay? And so the goal is a minimally decent life, and that's what we're trying to ensure for the children. The really important component of her particular argument here is that by using something like genetic screening, or just being very cautious whenever you have heritable genetic traits that lead to serious illness, she just wants to basically try to think, well, why would parents want to have kids whenever they know that for a very good chance, for a very good portion of their children, they're going to have these very, very serious illnesses? And so she tries to kind of like talk about what parents might be giving up, and she just doesn't think that much of this holds water. The arguments just don't hold up. And she says something along these lines, which is, parents aren't giving up anything of comparable importance to a child's preventable suffering. Okay? And to make this argument, she talks about what potentially a parent is giving up versus what is happening. And I want to read an excerpt. This is directly from her article. Expecting people to forego having genetically related children might seem to demand too great a sacrifice of them. But before reaching that conclusion, we need to ask, what is really at stake? One reason for wanting children is to experience family life, including love, companionship, watching kids grow, sharing their pains and triumphs, and helping to form members of the next generation. Other reasons emphasize the validation of parents as individuals within a continuous family line, children as a source of immortality, or perhaps even the gratification of producing partial replicas of oneself. Children may also be desired in an effort to prove that one is an adult, to try to cement a marriage, or to benefit parents economically. Are there alternative ways of satisfying these desires? Adoption or new reproductive technologies can fulfill many of them without passing on known genetic defects. Replacements for sperm have been available for many years via artificial insemination by donor. More recently, egg donation, sometimes in combination with contract pregnancy, has been used to provide eggs for women who prefer not to use their own. Eventually, it may be possible to clone individual humans, although that now seems a long way off. All of these approaches to avoiding the use of particular genetic material are controversial and have generated much debate. I believe that tenable moral versions of each do exist. None of these methods permits people to extend both genetic lines or realize the desire for immortality or for children who resemble both parents, nor is it clear that such alternatives will necessarily succeed in proving that one is an adult, cementing a marriage, or providing economic benefits. Yet many people feel these desires strongly. Now, I am sympathetic to William James's dictum regarding desires. Quote, "Take any demand, however slight, which any creature, however weak, may make. Ought it not, for its own soul's sake, be satisfied? If not, prove why not." End quote. Thus, a world where more desires are satisfied is generally better than one where fewer are. However, not all desires can be legitimately satisfied, since, as James suggests, there may be good reasons, which is such as the conflict of duty and desire, why some should be overruled. Fortunately, further scrutiny of the situation reveals that there are good reasons why people should attempt, with appropriate social support, to talk themselves out of the desires in question, or to consider novel ways of fulfilling them. Wanting to see the genetic line continued is not particularly rational when it brings a sinister legacy of illness and death. The desire for immortality cannot really be satisfied anyway, and people need to face the fact that what really matters is how they behave in their own lifetime. And finally, the desire for children who physically resemble one is understandable, but basically narcissistic, and its fulfillment cannot be guaranteed even by normal reproduction. There are other ways of proving one is an adult, and other ways of cementing marriages, and children don't necessarily do either. Children, especially prematurely ill children, may not provide the expected economic benefits anyway. Non-genetically related children may also provide benefits similar to those that would have been provided by genetically related ones, and expected economic benefits in many cases is a morally questionable reason for having children. Okay, so what Purdy is basically trying to say here is, let's look at all of the reasons why parents might want to have a genetically related child, even if that means that it runs the risk, a pretty good risk, let's say 50% chance of getting Huntington's. Why do they think that that is so important rather than using genetic screening technologies or just choosing not to have children of your own and adopting? And she says, well, what are the potential reasons? Maybe someone wants to have a family. Okay, adopt, right? You can find lots of really fantastic families with adopted children, right? Why don't you just do that if you want a family and avoid all of the illness and the distress and the suffering that come from a serious genetic illness? Well, maybe the parents will say, well, I want my kid to be a part of me. I want them to resemble me. And she's just going to say, that's just not good enough. You're narcissistic. Like, those reasons do not outweigh the considerable moral risk and the everyday suffering that will happen if there is a very serious illness in your child. And so for that reason, Purdy is going to say, we need to make sure that we are not bringing children with very, very serious illnesses into this world whenever we can, in fact, prevent that. And technology, especially something like prenatal genetic diagnosis, is something that can help us to prevent that harm. Okay. So the conclusion is we should select out certain traits. Let's go ahead and transition into Deena Davis's argument. So this is from Genetic Dilemmas and the Child's Right to an Open Future. She's going to take a slightly different direction, but is very much related. And this is partially because she has at the center of her article one particular scenario. And she says, imagine that you're a genetic counselor and you work in a lab that facilitates in vitro fertilization and prenatal genetic diagnosis. I can imagine this. I'm filling in a little bit of details. And your client, who is deaf, comes in and asks you to select an embryo with deafness. Okay? Should you do that? Should you, as the genetic counselor who is serving particular clients, agree that you are going to use your facilities to help them ensure that the child that they have will in fact be deaf like they are? All right. Her ultimate thesis is going to be, no, you shouldn't do that. And the reason why you shouldn't do that is because such choices violate the child's right to an open future, and it undermines the child's autonomy. Okay? And this is a case where rather than talking about beneficence or non-maleficence, so that is actively doing good or avoiding doing harm, she says this is a case of autonomy and autonomy. This is a case of a genetic counselor trying to decide whether they're going to value the parent's autonomy, right? They want to have the child who is deaf, versus the child's autonomy, who will be deaf whenever they are born. Okay? And this is kind of what she's dealing with. So let's look at her argument. One of the first things that she does is she tries to talk about how the Code of Ethics of the National Society of Genetic Counselors kind of places first and foremost an emphasis on respecting and trying to help the client by understanding their beliefs and respecting their culture. And what you're trying to do as a genetic counselor is to help them make informed and free decisions on what they're doing. All right. This stress on helping the client, the patient, and their autonomy is something that's coming out of, as a direct result, genetic counseling trying to distance itself as much as possible from the eugenics movements that happened in the early 1900s. They happened here in America, by the way. The Nazis actually took a lot of inspiration from American doctors. You can look this up on the history of eugenics. So, this isn't something constrained to Nazi Germany. This was largely born and reinforced here and went on to inspire all these types of terrible things. There are tons of documented experiments that I'm not really going to talk too much about, or the annihilation of people with certain intellectual disabilities. She's going to say, against that historical backdrop, it makes sense that the society, sorry, that's a typo. It shouldn't be the Natural Society. It should be the National Society. The National Society of Genetic Counselors, they're trying to get away from the eugenics movement, right? They also don't want to appear pro-abortion, like you shouldn't have a child and you should terminate any pregnancy with disability. So they're really trying to get away from the icky, really terrible ethical things that happen. And they're trying instead to place a lot of value on what the client or the patient themselves are trying to accomplish in this sort of thing. All right. What's kind of interesting with the case of deafness is, despite everything that Davis is kind of bringing up, she's also choosing a pretty ethically challenging thing to talk about. So as opposed to Purdy is talking about Huntington's, she's talking about Tay-Sachs, she's talking about other illnesses that are genetic and they lead to just debilitating illness with lots and lots of pain, quality of life goes down, and in the case of Huntington's, some of them even kill themselves because the quality of life is so bad, they feel the degeneration so deeply. Right? She's not talking about a case like that, which I think she would obviously say that's not a good thing. Rather, she's talking about deafness. And what makes this an ethically complicated thing to deal with is that deafness doesn't cause physical pain and it doesn't shorten lifespans. Those are obvious moral wrongs, according to Davis. But she's going to try to figure out, how is it the case that it violates the child's autonomy, which is going to be her argument. And she's going to say, largely this happens because it narrows the scope of the child's choices and it violates her right to an open future. And she makes a really strong analogy with the Amish. So she doesn't agree with the way that the American Supreme Court handled this particular case. Actually, let me back up to just the case of deafness. And I'll give you a little more details here. So she says, look, imagine a deaf couple approaching a genetic counselor. The couple's goals are to learn more about the causes of their own deafness, and if possible, to maximize the chance that any pregnancy they embark upon will result in a deaf child. Let us suppose that the couple falls into the 50% of clients whose deafness has a genetic origin. The genetic counselor, who adheres strictly to the tenets of client autonomy, will respond by helping the couple to explore the ways in which they can achieve their goal, a deaf baby. But, as Nance's depiction of this scenario suggests, the counselor may well feel extremely uneasy about her role here. It is one thing to support a couple's decision to take their chances and let nature take its course, but to treat as a goal what is commonly considered to be a risk may be more pressure than the value-neutral ethos can bear. What is needed is a principled argument against such assistance. The refusal need not to rise to a legal prohibition, but could become part of ethical norms and standard of care for the counseling profession. So this is just the scenario that I laid out at the beginning. And she's going to try to draw an analogy with the way in which a decision to have a deaf child violates the child's autonomy and closes off several options, thus violating their right to an open future. And she tries to find an analogy or an argument that relates in law, and namely, this happened in Amish communities. So here's what she says about this, and I'm going to read at length what she says about this. The second example is more controversial. In 1972, in a famous Supreme Court case, a group of Old Order Amish argued that they should be exempt from Wisconsin's requirement that all children attend school until they are either 16 years old or a graduate from high school. The Amish didn't have to send their children to public school, of course. They were free to create a private school of their own liking, but they framed the issue in the starkest manner. To send their children to any school past 8th grade would be antithetical to their religion and their way of life, and might even result in the death of their culture. The case was framed as a freedom of religion claim on the one hand, and the state's right to insist on educated citizenry on the other. And within that frame, the Amish won. First, they were able to persuade the court that sending their children to school after 8th grade would potentially destroy their community because it, and this is a quote from the case, takes them away from their community physically and emotionally during the crucial and formative adolescent period. During this period, the children must acquire Amish attitudes favoring manual work and self-reliance, and the specific skills needed to perform the adult role of an Amish farmer or housewife. In the Amish belief, higher learning tends to develop values that they reject as influences that alienate man from God. End quote. Second, the Amish argued that the state's concerns that children should be prepared to participate in the political and economic life of the state did not apply in this case. The court listened favorably to expert witnesses who explained that the Amish system of home-based vocational training, learning from your parent, worked well for that community, and that the community itself was prosperous, and that few Amish were likely to end up unemployed. The court said, this is another quote, "The value of all education must be assessed in terms of its capacity to prepare the child for life. It is one thing to say that compulsory education for a year or two beyond the 8th grade may be necessary when its goal is the preparation of the child for a life in modern society as the majority live. But it is quite another if the goal of education can be viewed as the preparation of the child for life in the separated agrarian community that is the keystone of the Amish faith." End quote. So this is what Davis goes on to say. What only a few justices saw that children themselves were largely ignored in this argument. The Amish wanted to preserve their way of life. The state of Wisconsin wanted to make sure that its citizens could vote wisely and make a living. No justice squarely faced the question of whether the liberal democratic state owes all its citizens, especially children, a right to a basic education that can serve as a block if the child decides later in life that she wishes to become an astronaut, a playwright, or perhaps join the army. As we constantly hear from politicians and educators, without a high school diploma, one's future is virtually closed. By denying them a high school education or its equivalent, parents are virtually ensuring that their children will remain housewives and agricultural laborers. Even if the children agree, is that a choice that parents ought to be allowed to make for them? So she says there is precedent for these types of concerns, and we don't even have to think about, again, the genetic technology. She's going to say, what about a case of the Amish? And look, deaf people have a culture. They aren't harmed, like physically. They have long, fulfilling lives. And this is why she likes to analogize it with the Amish. Amish people, they aren't harmed physically by being Amish. They live long, fulfilling lives. But rather than look at those particular things, she's saying there are implicit decisions being made here about the type of life that the child can live and the decisions that the parents are making before the child is even born, or while the child is fairly young and still in formation, The parents are making choices that make it practically impossible for the child to choose otherwise, and it therefore violates their autonomy. Okay. And she gives a few different ideas to kind of try and back this up. One is, the first thing that she tries to talk about is two different bases for liberalism. One is diversity of communities versus the autonomy of individuals. So what she means here by liberalism is just like a contemporary society like America. Typically, these were the societies that prized freedom, individual freedom in particular. But she's going to say in the literature, there's actually a couple of different ones. William Galston, he defends the idea of diversity of communities. So he's going to say, one of the things that society should do, a liberal society, in like the kind of political goals that we have in America, what we should do is we should try to allow as many communities to flourish as possible. And even where that might violate a particular individual's ability to choose different aspects of their life. So for example, if you're Amish, you cannot choose to do certain things if you live within that community, right? Despite that fact, what we should do is prize a diversity of communities, because that's what allows us to actually have a freedom that we can live on, a freedom to choose. We have to have options to choose, right? And what we want to prize in this diversity of communities view of liberalism is to make sure that there are lots of different types of communities, even if they restrict individual choice. The second option, and this is the autonomy of individuals option, is basically we need to allow individuals to have a real choice and to leave if they have the mind to do so. So she quotes at length John Stuart Mill, and John Stuart Mill has a type of libertarian philosophy, and he prizes individuality. And he's going to say cultural and traditional things are not a good basis for making decisions. You need to be making decisions on your own faculties. And so, given that we have these two radically conflicting ideas of liberalism, what should we do? Well, Davis tries to offer an alternative here. And what she's going to say is, what we should do in a liberal society is we should tolerate a diversity of communities. We should have Amish people, right? We should have deaf culture. We should have all sorts of other things. These are just the ones that she talks about in her paper. But what we should do is also prioritize individual liberty, meaning whenever these two things conflict, we choose individual liberty over diversity of communities. Okay? And one of the things that she's trying to say here is that there's a limiting rule operative here. Individual autonomy is prized over group autonomy, and the state absolutely should intervene in any case where the individual's actual ability to make choices is damaged. All right? So she's going to say, I don't agree with what the courts decided in the Amish cases where they allowed children to have their education stopped at the 8th grade level. Because what that does is it limits any person who grew up in that community to just staying in that community. Even if they wanted to leave, what are they going to do without a high school education and with no concept of the things that you learn in high school? What are they going to do without that? Practically speaking, how are they going to get a job? How are they going to go on to get further education? It's going to be really, really tough. And whenever you look at the practical ways in which a child's future is limited by this particular choice, you cannot justify what's going on. The state absolutely has to step in there and make sure that the child's individual freedom is being protected in that particular area. What she's going to say in cases like this is that there's no neutral or impartial stance here, okay? One of the benefits of, say, something like libertarian or classically liberal political philosophy is that you're trying to make sure that the government is as minimal as possible. Maybe, so someone like Robert Nozick is going to say all a government should do is basically ensure forbearance rights, make sure that no one is being harmed against their will, right? You have a right to your body, and anyone who violates that, the government can step in and stop that, right? And then the second thing that a government would do is basically to ensure that contracts are upheld. So if I agree that I'm going to do something, a government will step in if I go back on that, right? Especially in the context of formalized contracts. The reason why you might want something like that is because a government is going to say there are certain things that are over the line: murder, assault, fraud, those things are bad and the government will step in on them. But anything else the government is going to let fly. Contrast that with something like the ancient Greeks. The ancient Greeks thought that there was a certain way of being a Greek and being enculturated, and if you did not speak the right dialect, if you did not know the particular songs and the poems, if you did not, have the type of Greek attributes, you were not having a proper education and you were not properly Greek. The downside of that Greek stance is that anyone who comes out of that ancient Greek education system is going to look fairly similar to one another, right? There's not a lot of diversity there. You're coming out Greek because that's what the education system is trying to do. So the liberal education system, as opposed to the Greek one, is going to say, like, look, I'm not trying to enculturate you in certain ways. I'm trying to be as neutral as possible, right? That's one of the goals of classically liberal political philosophy. But Davis is going to say, that doesn't stack up at all. There is no neutrality. There is no impartiality here. In the case of the Amish, where you're trying to be neutral and where you're trying to allow Amish people to decide their own community, fine, but that's not neutral. You are shutting kids off by stopping their education at the 8th grade level. This is what Davis is trying to get us to see, right? And given that there isn't a neutrality, she's going to say, maybe it's the case that we allow the Amish to keep on going, but what we don't do is allow them to do radical things like stop a child's education before 9th grade or before a high school education. We just don't do that because it limits the choices too much. Maybe we give them a high school education. Maybe we don't even say that a college education or anything like that is necessary. You can still be Amish after you have your high school education. That's perfectly fine. I think she would be okay with that. But she would say, it is not the case that we're just going to corner people into things in the name of neutrality, because there is no neutrality here, and the system will choose one way or the other. And if it has to choose one way or the other, Davis is going to pick the autonomy of individuals over any other value. This eventually leads to her talking about the relationship between parents and children. And the core idea here is that she's going to say it's wrong to force a child to live the parent's version of the good life. I was blessed with parents who let me do whatever I want. They let me do the bad thing of getting a PhD in philosophy, despite the fact that they didn't have an education. They could have said, you need to be a lawyer or a doctor or whatever else. Joke's on them. I became the useless kind of doctor and got a PhD. But what she's arguing against here are parents who just kind of like helicopter their children and make sure that they do exactly what they did. I am a surgeon child, so you are going to be a surgeon like me, and you are going to go to this undergrad because I went there, and then you're going to go to medical school at this school, and then you are going to do a residency and a fellowship and take your boards in this particular area of medicine, and this is what you're going to do because this is the conception of a good life. She's going to say, that's wrong. You're taking away the child's choice. That is not something that's good. And whenever you're doing something like that, it's very clear that you're violating a couple key Kantian keystones. So she starts to make a fairly Kantian argument in these regards. One, whenever you do this, whenever you force your child to live that version of the good life by closing off all other options, you're undermining that child's autonomy. They can't choose to do what they want to do because you're forcing them to live that particular life. Second of all, a child or an adult, right? Because the children turn into adults. They have dignity. They have a price that's beyond all worth, and they should be allowed to use their reason and choose the life that they want to lead, right? And whenever you are using a rational creature, you are violating their dignity. You're using someone with dignity as a mere means, and Kant is going to say, you can't do that. So these things really go against the idea that we should be forcing children into certain types of decisions. And so she gives this particular quote, and I think that this is the central idea in this particular section. She says, good parenthood requires a balance between having a child for our own sakes and being open to the moral reality that the child will exist for her own sake, with her own talents and weaknesses, propensities and interests, and with her own life to make. Parental practices that close exits virtually forever are insufficiently attentive to the child as an end in herself. By closing off the child's right to an open future, they define the child as an entity who exists to fulfill parental hopes and dreams, not her own. Okay. So what's going on here is that Davis is basically saying, whenever, for example, a child or a parent is trying to choose what the child can do, you can't do it in such a way that it closes off virtually, right? Or practically speaking, a lot of different options. So it was wrong in her argument that the Amish don't allow their children to be educated past the 8th grade. And it's wrong of any deaf couple to want to have a child who's also deaf because of all of the challenges that they're going to face. So let me emphasize a couple of points before I move on to some general conclusions. Basically, the idea, and we'll go back to the case of deafness, is that you can't do this. It's very clear that there is a deaf culture. For anyone who's been around a school of the deaf, or if you're in a city where there's a large deaf community, you can find this sort of thing. And it is the case, especially in cities in America, that most occupations can in fact be adopted with technology to help that person to do many, many fantastic things. But in reality, there are still many occupations and lifestyles that would be closed off to a deaf child. Okay? And forcing the child to be deaf when you had a genetic choice to make sure that the child could hear, that is something that is violating the child's right to an open future. And again, we can take sort of with a little bit of a flexible stance, we can understand that the idea of society being really unjust, maybe it shouldn't be the case. And maybe we should advocate, we should fight like hell to make sure that people with disabilities have the resources and the accommodations that they need to live a life that they want to live. You can totally say that that's right. But she's going to say, given the reality, if you make that child be born deaf today, that's going to lead to a lot of difficulties and it's going to close off aspects of their future. And if you are using technology actively to promote such a closing off of the future, then you are doing something wrong. So I think I've emphasized what she said and what the case is that she makes here. So I want to talk about some general conclusions between the two articles. And these aren't necessarily things that they brought up themselves, but I think that these are things that both cases have in common. And one is this idea that there used to be a lot of things that are outside of our control, things like our health. Philosophers call this moral luck. Moral luck is something that's outside of your control that nonetheless impacts the quality of your life in an ethical or a moral sense. Health is largely one of these things. I didn't choose to have certain types of health things that I have going on, but it is something that impacts my life, right? But with the advent of in vitro fertilization and prenatal genetic diagnosis and other types of technology, we can begin to intervene with technology. So there are ways in which unjust or maybe unfair things happened naturally, right? And we used to just call it moral luck, but it's not the case anymore, because more and more illnesses are in the purview of genetic types of technologies, and we have to decide whether or not we are going to let nature keep on doing what it's doing and squarely allow luck to take its place, or whether we decide that luck isn't good enough and we start to intervene. But once we start to do that, right, we face basically the fact that we can prevent actual harm. So in the case of Huntington's or Tay-Sachs or any number of genetic diseases where there's lots and lots of suffering, and we can screen for it and we can make sure that healthy embryos, for example, are implanted rather than ones that have Huntington's or Tay-Sachs, she's going to say, both the philosophers, Purdy and Davis, they're going to say we can actually prevent harm, right? And insofar as we can prevent lots of harm, we should do that. But the extent of the harm matters, right? So there's a really big difference between the Huntington's disease argument. So this is what Purdy is talking about. It's really easy to justify, at least relatively speaking, why we shouldn't allow Huntington's disease to continue on in the gene pool if we have a way of eliminating that particular disease. But it's much, much more difficult to talk about something like deafness or something like achondroplasia, which is a type of dwarfism, right? In these cases where there isn't necessarily lots of physical harm or where lifespan is roughly about the same, right? There's much less severe harms, and this is where the arguments start to shift. So Purdy successfully, and I don't know if she's a utilitarian, but she can make a fairly convincing utilitarian argument of we should prevent really severe harms, right? But that argument doesn't necessarily apply in cases of deafness or achondroplasia. And so the argument in those spheres, at least in the case of Davis, shifts to something else. Now we're not just concerned about preventing harm or non-maleficence. Maybe we're also concerned about ensuring the autonomy of the child, right? And so depending on the cases that you're dealing with, the ethical arguments can start to shift. That's why we have the 4 principles. That's why we have multiple different ways of talking about ethics in bioethics. And it's because the cases are going to bring out different features and they're going to be justified in different types of ways. As a last thing, I kind of want to talk about disability because in this video and in the unit that we've done, we haven't really talked too much about it. But there's a couple of different ways that we can kind of think about disability. One is in a biological or a psychological sense. So maybe we could do something like try and do some sort of species typical average or a norm, and we can kind of see what humans on the average do. And we can try to come up with an idea of disability where it's something that deviates from the norm, from statistical norms in a very severe way. So what makes something, for example, like quadriplegia a disability would be that most humans on the average are able to move around and get around on their own, and they don't need the aid of whatever it is, a wheelchair or anything like that to help that, right? But there are a lot of disability theorists who are not going to like that particular version of defining a disability. And that's because it's hard to find these species typical averages. And it's not clear that you can define health in purely descriptive, biological, or psychological ways. And what some disability theorists are going to say, so here I'm thinking of Anita Silvers, what she's going to say is that a lot of disability is really just the ways in which our communities are arranged in unfair or unjust ways. People with quote unquote disabilities, they could actually lead very fulfilling, very fantastic lives if society spent the time and the resources to help them to do that, right? But this also gives rise to a bunch of other questions in political philosophy about how it is the case that we justify spending more money and more resources on, public buildings or whatever else it is to accommodate people with disabilities, right? What justifies that sort of choice? And we don't have to go into any of this, but I just wanted to say disability doesn't necessarily have to be defined in the ways that I've defined it here. And there are people that are going to say that community arrangements, that's where the disability is. It's not in the person, right? A person themselves aren't disabled because they have different physical or psychological abilities. What the disability is located, or where it's located, is in the society because they haven't accommodated people in the right way. That said, I think this gives rise to basically the central medical question, which is, can we identify traits as undesirable while still treating disabled people with dignity? Okay, and I really want to draw this contrast because it's really important. Is it possible for us to say Huntington's disease or Tay-Sachs or achondroplasia or deafness, those things are not desirable? Those are not things that we should desire or that we should choose in children that we're trying to conceive and have if we have a choice, right? So we're taking a stance potentially to say we don't want those things. Certain disability theorists are going to say if we do that, if we screen for certain illnesses, if we call certain traits disabilities, what that might lead to is us devaluing people who have those particular traits. It leads to harmful stereotypes. It leads to not respecting the dignity of people with disabilities. And so the question becomes, just what is put here. Can we identify certain traits as bad things while nonetheless respecting the people who do have these particular traits and making sure that they can live as good a life as possible? I hope I'm making sense with that particular point. And this is one of the big debates that's still happening in disability theory. A lot of people are going to say, we can make sure that we are respecting the dignity of persons with disabilities and that we are doing everything that we can to accommodate them. Nonetheless, there can still be a moral obligation to screen for these types of things and to make sure that the human genetic pool does not have certain disabilities anymore, right? But other disability theorists are going to say there is something inherently harmful in you characterizing certain traits as disabilities and trying to get rid of those particular traits. I'm not going to tell you which way to believe one way or the other, but I definitely wanted to bring that up as a closing issue. So I just want to thank you for your attention, and I hope that this has raised some interesting ethical questions for you. I will see you next time.